Hello and welcome to the CX Files for 19th December 2024. This is the last episode of the year. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan, back in Montreal after a whirlwind trip to South Africa and to Europe. Mark, good to see you, and really quite quite taken aback, almost breathless, the fact that literally we are at the end of 2024. Next time that we catch up, it will be the new year, and we'll be using 2025 as our moniker.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this podcast itself, if you look at the back catalogue, it's up to about 360 interviews now. So
Yeah.
it's actually becoming a sort of phenomenal resource of interviews and observations on what's been taking place in CX over the last few years.
What's even more interesting is the fact that if we're at 360 interviews, that means literally if somebody started listening to the CX files an episode a day, it would take them an entire year to get through it. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They might not be able to tolerate listening to us every single day for a year,
I think they tolerate listening to you. Listening to me is another kettle of fish.
though.
I hear that a lot from people.
Well, as we've got the Christmas holiday bells jingling away in the background here, why don't you introduce our latest interview or our last interview of the year then? Because we're going to shut down for a couple of weeks and then come back in the new year. So why don't you take it away?
So, Mark, this week we are really lucky to finish off the CX files for 2024 with a superb interview with Mark Lowe. Now, Mark is based in Italy and he is an expert when it comes to risk management. I've had a number of different chats with Mark over the years, and I thought it would be good for Mark to come on the pod to chat a little bit about what some of the considerations are that a BPO operator, whether it's somebody at the CEO level or somebody in operations, needs to be considering when they're going about their strategic planning, when they're investigating a potential new location in which to set up, around what are some of the considerations that they might be incurring risk-wise. Look, Mark, you know as well as I do, there are a lot of different risks out there, and in many cases, outsourcers, given the global nature of the sector, are very exposed. We've got elements such as climate risk, there's natural disasters, geopolitical risk, economic risk. So Mark was able to give us his insights based on his years of experience, decades of experience in risk management, about what some of the considerations might be and how BPOs might be able to think about checking against this risk and balancing out this risk with a variety of different strategies.
Yeah. I mean, and there's interesting points there, and a number of different areas. Certainly, one of the things you can immediately see when you're handling a customer's information is you are probably going to have a lot of their personal data, their payment details, their private home address. So clearly, any organization that's especially a BPO, if you are handling someone else's customers with all of their details, then clearly you have a data privacy risk and a risk of this information being accessed by a third party. And clearly that also then creates a reputational risk. When hacks do happen, it can be extremely damaging in terms of just trying to get things working again. But even worse, when the media gets hold of the story and finds out that millions of customers' private details have been exposed.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. There's all sorts of different considerations that leaders of outsourcing organizations, or for that matter, captive CX operations, need to be thinking about. And I tend to feel that historically, many of these considerations, many of these different perhaps risky elements or nefarious elements have not been given the space at the boardroom table that they have deserved. But I'd say now that's not the case, because as we look at it, Mark, really, whether it's cyber risk, whether it's geopolitical risk, whether it is situations related to the climate, it's all coming at the same time. Your example about data security and information privacy, there's another one. It's actually quite frightening when you try and encapsulate all these different risk elements. But it's something that leaders of BPOs and captive CX have to do. So it was great that we were able to catch up with Mark to get his insights, but not just his insights, but also some strategies on what that can be done to mitigate some of these concerns.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's extremely useful, and I think that, I mean, as you're saying, things like climate change and climate risk. Often people think about this as something that just happens somewhere else, and it's something that's maybe going to affect us in the future. But you've only got to look back to November and look at what happened in Spain. You know, major developed areas around Valencia and Barcelona. Places just being flooded and hundreds of people killed. And, you know, these are the sort of disasters that you just don't expect in major urban areas like this in developed countries. So, you know, it's definitely something that needs to be considered. And certainly, you know, geographic spreading risk geographically is something that we've seen BPOs using as a tool to sell their services in the past, you know, to actually spread risk across multiple locations.
That's it. And I think that it's probably time for us to go to the discussion we had with Mark, our final interview of 2024, and hear a little bit about how best to mitigate risky elements, how best to manage risk, and what can be done in order to ensure as steady a ship of state in 2025 as possible.
Well, happy Christmas and happy holidays to everybody, and we'll see you on the other side.
Indeed, happy holidays. The CX Files takes a risk management turn today. Now, one of the things that I, as an analyst, have been trying to promote as a consideration for my clients over my 2+ decades in the contact center and customer experience management space is the need for organizations, whether it's BPOs or enterprises, when setting up a new operation, going in and setting up a new site, to take into consideration what are some of the key risk factors of a particular city, of a particular jurisdiction, whether it's at the state or even national or potentially even regional level. I've wanted to explore this for some time, and I couldn't be more pleased to welcome my friend Mark Lowe, who joins us from his home in Italy. Mark is an expert in corporate risk management and somebody who I've had the pleasure of interacting with for the past few years. Mark, really delighted to have you on the podcast today. And maybe as a point of departure, could you tell our listening audience a little bit about who you are and what you do before we get into the nitty-gritty around the CX community?
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it is absolutely my pleasure to be here with you. So, as a very brief introduction, my principal activity is that of assisting companies that are entering new geographical markets. Now, they could be entering those markets because they want to distribute a product, or they could be entering those markets because they want perhaps to open a factory and start manufacturing in said country or region. So my role is basically to work with those inside the company and assist them first and foremost in analyzing a series of risks and challenges that they will come across in these countries or in these regions, and then understanding those risks and therefore building a capability to develop mitigation policies and procedures. And also because however much we can focus on mitigating certain risks and certain challenges, we're never ever going to eliminate them 100%. So we also need to know, what do we do in terms of management should the mitigation policies and protocols not actually be sufficient? So just to summarize, my job is basically that of working with the company to understand the challenges that they are going to face and to help them to address these challenges in the most efficient manner possible.
Okay, that's a fantastic level of context for the chat we're going to have today, Mark, because, you know, I do think that from the perspective of the global economy, there's not that many industries that are as at risk out there from geopolitical upheaval or climate upheaval as the contact center space? We've got organizations that literally have contact centers in 50, 60 different cities around the world, multiple different regions, multiple different countries. And as we're finishing off this year, I can't recall a year in which we have seen so much upheaval. Over the course of the past 12 months, there has been multiple instances of disruption from a geopolitical context. We're seeing changes in the climate and in climate events like we've never seen before. As you think about this in the context of the contact center and the CX industry, if you were advising the CEO of an organization involved in running contact center operations to be keeping their eyes on potential areas of upheaval, disruption, risk, what would be the key ones that you would tell them using your crystal ball that they should really be focused on over the course of the end of this year going into 2025?
Right, that's a very good question, and let's address it by stages. But if I may, I will make a bit of a caveat, and I'll link my caveat back to what you just said. We live in very dynamic times. Let me be diplomatic and call the scenario one that's particularly dynamic. Things are changing very, very rapidly. What we have to do is to look at the bigger picture. We can't isolate specific events from a far larger picture. And we can make a direct relationship between climate change and geopolitical tensions. That's very, very easy to do. It's very, very logical. So basically, what we have to be very much focused on is understanding the bigger picture, after which going vertically and examining single elements that could be disruptive or could present specific challenges. Now, I mean, the most obvious reply to your question is yes, we have to absolutely focus on geopolitical and political instability. So geopolitical in terms of regional issues and problems, political in terms of changes to governments in countries that are stable, countries that are less stable. So we have to keep our eye very much on the ball in terms of both geopolitical changes and political disruptions. Now, I think we're all quite well versed on what that means, so I shan't dwell on that one. But another one that I would raise is supply chain and logistics volatility, in the sense that the industry is very, very dependent on technology. And when I move into another country, I'm going to have to bring in a lot of hardware. I'm going to have to bring in a lot of technology. Am I absolutely certain that there are not going to be any disruptors that could be sanctions, or they could be sanctions placed on countries that I'm actually exporting the technology from? So supply chain is one issue that does need to be taken into consideration. Other areas that need to be taken into consideration are economic shifts, inflationary pressures. For example, I'm going to be very, very much an energy carnivore. So I'm going to be consuming a large amount of energy. Are my energy costs going to suddenly skyrocket, or rather going to be stable? When I'm looking at a 3-4 year plan, I really have to factor in the consequences of large increases in energy prices. So that's another area to take into consideration, as well as technological disruptions. We have to take a very, very close look at client preferences, which can actually change over time. Clients may in the future prefer to have far more sort of automation-driven solutions. So we have to be ready, and we have to be able to adapt to those changes on the parts of our clients. How important is artificial intelligence going to be? How prepared are we to embrace and to use the advantages of artificial intelligence? And are there any particular considerations related to artificial intelligence that are very, very specific to the countries that we're operating in? And almost lastly, I would also cite, and I hate to do this because the cybersecurity threat is one that we're all very, very well aware of, but in these extremely geopolitically unstable times, the cybersecurity element is ever more important. There are a number of factors that are issues of concern. So cybersecurity, for example, is no longer simply a criminal activity, but can be one that has the backing of a state that perhaps wants to damage our original nation, or perhaps damage our host nation where we're actually operating. So the cybersecurity issue is another one that we have to be very, very careful of.
Okay, Mark, that's some really good, I think, opening salvos for our discussion here. So I'm going to put myself in the shoes of the head of a contact center organization, whether it's an enterprise captive organization or an outsourcer. You're advising me on risk mitigation. What would you say are the key tenets of a risk mitigation strategy that a leader of an organization should be considering and should be cascading down to the various members of the executive team and asking them to follow?
Right. Well, my answer to that would be, first and foremost, let's eliminate any internal risks. We have to work as a team. We have to avoid working in silos. We want our risk management people to be speaking with human resources, to be speaking with the legal functions and departments. We want to involve our security managers. We want to involve our procurement people. We've got to work as a team. So we've got to understand exactly what we want to do. We've got to understand the various risks and the various roles and responsibilities in mitigating against and managing these risks. So the starting point has absolutely to be, from the top towards the bottom, a firm understanding of the fact that we have to have and we have to act as a team. Once we have that in place, we can then start taking a look at some other risk mitigation strategies that can be the diversification, the geographic diversification of the various centers. This in order to eliminate the risk of finding ourselves in grave difficulty due to localized disruptions. So perhaps we might take into consideration the idea of having multiple centers. A lot of people are obviously doing this already. But then another question arises, if I have a local disruption, can a center in another region or a center in another country then cover that temporary disruption in, for the sake of argument, Vietnam as opposed to Mexico? Another thing I think is very, very important, given the fact that we are living in an absolutely digital world, is an firm investments in digital resilience. So we very much have to invest in very robust digital infrastructure. We mentioned cybersecurity already. But we don't only have to protect ourselves against data breaches, but we also have to have systems in place that can resist technical failures, power outages, and the cyber attacks, etc. Also, hybrid and remote flexibility. Can our people work from home if, and I link this to climate change, there is a meteorological event that is particularly damaging nature that makes it very, very difficult for my employees to come into the center? Do we have a backup? I say this because it's in front of all of our eyes. Extreme meteorological events are getting far more violent and unfortunately far more frequent with every passing year. So I really do have to take into consideration the eventuality that my center might not be reachable, or the people that are working for me might have difficulty in even exiting the areas that they live in. So those are just some of the mitigation concerns that I would raise immediately. Perhaps to that, I would add diversify client portfolio. That's slightly outside of our discussion. That's very much a strategic and marketing commercial strategy. But there can arise in times of crisis scenarios whereby a sector that perhaps has been a mainstay of our client base that is no longer such. So again, monitor what's happening in the different sectors that you're working with. Try and understand if they're making a switch into alternative solutions.
I want to touch on the climate one, Mark, because the weather disruptions. I think we're only starting to see the beginning of what this could really look like. And I'll just give you a quick example here. As you know, I live in Montreal, Quebec, and in August, there was one of several hurricanes that occurred in the United States, badly hit Florida. But something that we had never seen before were the vestiges of this hurricane actually made their way up towards the northeast of the United States and Canada. We had in less than 24 hours 200 millimeters of rain. That flooded out literally hundreds of thousands of residences in the greater Montreal area. And to what you were speaking about in terms of the impact on the labor force, for putting aside the material damage for a second, the labor force was severely disrupted. Several metro stations were flooded out. Trains couldn't operate. And if you're considering operating a contact center in a city like Montreal, which does have a fairly large contact center community, I could only imagine the impact that that was having on people trying to get to work or trying to go home from work when you've got all this water that's just deluging down, and you cascade that out across literally hundreds, if not thousands, of cities around the world at any one time that are dealing with this climate crisis. It's a very, very scary thing. And when we consider that element around climate change, Mark, what should organizations in the CX space be thinking about? What should they be doing? What action should they be taking now, and should they be planning to take moving into the next year in order, obviously not to eliminate the risk, because you're never going to eliminate a climate risk, but in order to best mitigate against it?
Well, unfortunately, well, of course, every single one of us can implement a series of measures aimed at reducing our impact on climate change. But none of us has the ability to whip out a magic wand and resolve the problem tomorrow. So what basically we have to do is to recognize that this is a reality. Not only is it a reality, but, and as much as I hate to say this, it is going to get worse. There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever. So we have to be very, very much focused on mitigation. What does that mean? In our specific case, that means what alternatives do we have? What measures can we put into place when the power supply has gone out, or our employees are unable to reach the center? Is hybrid working an alternative? What sort of disaster plan do we actually have? Planning is extremely important, and it is one of the keys of mitigation. So we do very much need to focus on our disaster preparedness plans and testing them and making sure that they're not simply some sort of tick box exercise, making absolutely certain that when a crisis actually hits, all of a sudden nobody can find the disaster preparedness plan, nobody can find the incident response plan. We have to be well versed in what actually needs to be done on the occasion of finding ourselves in a specific form of crisis. Now, we're talking about climate. We can be talking about flooding. We can be talking about hurricanes or wildfires, but we can also be talking about a deluge. You mentioned a huge amount of rain falling in the space of very, very few hours. That can just disrupt power supplies. So in our centers, are we absolutely certain that we have backup generators, for the sake of argument? And if we have the backup generators, do we have enough fuel to keep the generators running for a couple of days? Are we actually certain that the fuel for our generators is correctly protected and hasn't been stolen over the last few weeks or few months? These are just some examples that come immediately to mind. But the bottom line is really very much the sad case of having always to take into consideration worst case scenarios. Don't ignore anything. Don't think that you are immune to the worst, because that's simply not true. So we do need to take a very, very close look at what can happen, and then once we've understood that, analyzing what we can do to reduce the impact of an extreme weather event. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be an extreme weather event. Let me make another example. A particularly hot and prolonged summer gives rise to an ever greater use of air conditioning. an ever greater use of air conditioning requires a lot of energy. That can lead to blackouts, to power shortages. Again, we go back to, do I have backup electricity supply? So a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration. And obviously, dependent on where we are geographically, our concerns in regards to the impact of climate change can be quite diverse. Some areas will have much wetter weather. Some areas will have much warmer summers. Others will have much colder winters. So again, there is no single solution that works for absolutely everybody. We have to be very, very aware of where we are and what can happen in the location that we find ourselves in.
You know, Mark, as a follow-on from that, you mentioned earlier on the term diversification. Now, you use it in the context of client diversification, but as you well know, the CX and the contact center space is very much focused on diversification of delivery points. So with yourself being based in Italy, as I'm sure you know, many contact centers are based in Croatia, in Slovenia, in Romania, that are serving with Italian-speaking agents, serving the Italian consumer population. Obviously, South Africa, India, the Philippines, very important for the English-speaking world. Morocco, Tunisia, Senegal, certainly imperative for the French-speaking world. What I'd like to get at here is maybe the elephant in the room when I think people are talking about risk management from a geopolitical standpoint. Obviously, there are a lot of sensitivities that have popped up the last few years in different parts of the world. And those sensitivities can relate directly to particular countries, particular regions where conflicts might be occurring. So do you have any thoughts on regions that you see right now that are especially sensitive? Maybe the usual suspects or the obvious ones, any ones that you think might be bubbling under the surface that the outsourcing community and the enterprise community running their own contact centers might want to think about that could be especially prone to risk going into next year and through the course of 2025?
Well, there are a number of regions where, for example, political instability is always bubbling under the surface. That's very, very true in a lot of Latin American countries. It's also true in a lot of North African, Maghreb nations as well. And then if we take a look at some of the Eastern European nations, they might be very, very stable today. They might be very, very attractive today, but unfortunately, we still have a war going on in Europe. We can't forget about that. We haven't forgotten about that. But what we have to do is to reason in terms of how could that expand? What is the worst case scenario? Do I really want to be looking at investing in countries that are bordering the conflict? Could this conflict spill over? Unfortunately, we have to take that sort of consideration and analyze it correctly. So we are looking at countries also where there is the potential for a political upheaval, or indeed an economic collapse. So there are, and we have to remember, the world is a very, very dynamic place. It's as simple as that. And certain countries within the world are particularly dynamic and unstable, where change can occur very, very quickly. You mentioned earlier on Tunisia. Tunisia had a very, very important election just a few days ago, the result of which was decided long before anybody actually went to cast the vote. But how much longer will Tunisia be a stable nation? Is there a risk of the population returning once again to the revolt that we saw just over 10 years ago? That's not to be forgotten at all. On the other hand, there are other nations that are emerging that are very, very interesting, that are far more stable. In Europe, I'm thinking Poland, albeit a nation that borders Ukraine. Romania is another very stable nation. And I remember some time back, I think you published an article on North Macedonia, which is another very, very interesting country. But there, again, we have to take into consideration, is North Macedonia's current government going to get into a fight with Europe, or is it not? the current government in North Macedonia has had a few squabbles with Europe, and there's plenty of potential for that to actually get worse. So do I want to be investing in what is actually a wonderful country? I know Macedonia very well. It's a fantastic place with great potential, with great people, but there is always that element of geopolitical uncertainty. Other parts of the world, if we go back to Africa, if we take a look at South Africa or Kenya, again, two very, very interesting nations, each of which, however, presents a series of not indifferent challenges, even taking the security of our people that will be actually traveling there to set up the business. There is a lot of violence in Kenya. There's a lot of violence and a lot of crime in South Africa. Obviously, in some areas more, in some areas less. But this is another issue that we have to take into consideration when we are examining the opportunity of entering a new geographic region, the security of our people. Obviously, there are other areas to approach with enormous caution. I mean, quite obviously, the Middle East at the moment is not a place where anybody really wants to take a serious look at in terms of any form of major investment. And we shall see what the developments are in the Middle East. But you know, one thing is certain, that the situation is not going to get any better quickly, and it's something that's going to last a long time in terms of the great instability that's present at the moment. And we may very, very well see a completely redefined Middle East at some point in the future. So yes, there are certainly areas that are far riskier and areas that are far more far closer to our requirements.
I'm going to be provocative here for a second, Mark. And at time of recording, it's mid-October. We're a few weeks away from the election in the United States, which I think obviously the world will be watching like never before. We've also had some very contentious election results in different parts of Western Europe. I am thinking specifically about Austria recently. I'm thinking a little bit about some of the regional elections in Germany, the Netherlands, and what's been going on there. How do you assess what we would call traditional onshore country risk, i.e. North America, Western Europe, with some of the rise of more extreme parties on the left and on the right, and the impact that could potentially have on how business is done from a customer experience standpoint or otherwise that CX professionals might want to be thinking about? And I don't want to get political here, but I'm thinking specifically from a risk angle.
No, absolutely, and we shall not become political at all. But I'm in Italy. 2 years ago, Italy elected its first ever right-wing government. It had a series of centre-right governments. Think back to the occasions in which Silvio Berlusconi was prime minister. Great fear. Oh, we have this right-wing government. Giorgia Meloni is, etc., etc., etc. End result, I think Italy is actually far more stable today than it was 2 years ago. And this, more than anything else, is due to the fact that when we have a certain change, and again, we can go back to the European countries that you mentioned earlier on, when there is, in this specific case, a bit of a move towards the right, in reality, yes, some of the politicians, some of the parties are making a lot of rock and roll and saying rather radical and unpleasant things in regards to immigration, for example. But in reality, what they want to do is protect the interests of their own countries. So they're not going to close the door on any form of foreign investment. A series of protectionist elements may be put into place. A series of protectionist reforms may actually be enacted, but generally that brings more stability. And there is certainly quite a tide of change in Europe in terms of it's almost it comes in waves. Things change. These are all democratic nations, and they will go from one form of government to another, as any self-respecting democracy actually does. But I don't, specifically in Europe, see any great risks of civil revolt, revolution, or similar. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said in a number of other geographical regions. But there is quite simply, a tendency in Europe right at the moment to take a very, very closer look at electing right-wing governments, some of which can be considered as quite extreme. But what generally happens is that at the end of the day, in terms of stability, there are no great concerns. Reforms that could perhaps limit the amount of a shareholding, for example, so a very important consideration. Can I, as, for example, an American company, come into a European nation and own 100% of the company that I'm going to create in that country? Or will some reform be pushed through whereby I can only own up to 49%? That sort of thing has always to be taken into consideration. But these are political considerations, political in the sense of legislative considerations, and obviously legislative considerations are very often determined by who is in power at that moment.
Super duper. Well, Mark, thank you. This has been an outstanding discussion for the CX files. And I think there's a lot of very interesting fodder that you brought to the table that our listeners not only should be thinking about, but should be acting on. So great to have you on, and we look forward to future discussions.
Well, Peter, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure. And I very, very much hope that your listeners enjoy this conversation as much as I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.